In this video, we'll be talking about external and internal respiration. When we're talking about respiratory physiology, we mean something a little bit different by respiration than you might typically think. In this case, respiration basically means gas exchange. And by gases, we mean oxygen and carbon dioxide, the respiratory gases. External, we mean gas exchange in the lungs. Internal, we mean gas exchange at the tissues, the peripheral tissues, the ones that aren't in the lungs. Now, to orient ourselves, remember that these are the four processes involved in getting oxygen to our tissues and getting carbon dioxide back out of our body. This video talks about external respiration and internal respiration. External respiration depends on a few different things. So talking about external respiration, it depends on the structure of the respiratory membrane, for one. And remember, the respiratory membrane is the barrier to gas exchange at the alveoli. So you have this thin alveolar epithelium, you have a thin capillary wall, and you have a little bit of basement membrane in between them. Alveolar, capillary, and basement membrane. This respiratory membrane is, it's important that it be not an excessive barrier to gas exchange, so it's important that it be absolutely thin. Most of the alveolar epithelium is simple squamous, the capillary endothelium is simple squamous, and the fused basement membrane between the two is very thin as well. The second thing that external respiration depends on is matching ventilation and perfusion. This slide illustrates what I mean by matching ventilation and perfusion. Ventilation is airflow to a single alveolus. Perfusion is blood flow to the capillary bed around that alveolus. Now, if you think about it, the whole point of sending blood to the lungs is to pick up oxygen and drop off carbon dioxide. In order for both of these functions to work, you need to have effective air exchange at that alveolus. And sometimes there are areas of our lungs that aren't working as well. Maybe we have an infection, maybe we have some other kind of inflammation going on, or damage. You don't want to waste sending blood to that damaged area of the lungs when you could shunt the blood over to another part of the lung that's working fine and actually pick up some oxygen and get rid of some carbon dioxide. So you want good perfusion and good ventilation together. One without the other is just useless. In order to match ventilation and perfusion, you have responses both of the arterioles and of the bronchioles. The arterioles, which control blood flow to the capillary bed, respond to oxygen. The bronchioles respond to carbon dioxide. Now, the response of the arterioles to oxygen in the lungs is the opposite of what you find in peripheral tissues. In the lungs, increased oxygen leads to arterial dilation, so that the blood can go there and pick up that oxygen. Decreased oxygen leads to arterial constriction, so that the blood gets shunted off to more productive areas of the lungs. In the bronchioles, increased carbon dioxide leads to bronchial dilation, so that that alveolus inflates better and you can get rid of that carbon dioxide. Decreased carbon dioxide leads to bronchial constriction, because there's probably not much blood coming in, there's not much carbon dioxide being left out, it's not necessary to inflate that alveolus. This diagram shows you a couple of different scenarios. In this first scenario, you have poor alveolar ventilation. This could also be seen as excessive perfusion. But now, because you have poor alveolar ventilation, there's less oxygen coming in. So the decreased oxygen leads to arterial constriction, which decreases perfusion to match that reduced ventilation of that particular alveolus. In scenario B, the second one, let's say the problem isn't with ventilation, the problem is with perfusion. So you have poor perfusion. If you have poor perfusion, you're going to get an accumulation of oxygen in the alveolus because that oxygen isn't going to be carried by the blood, carried away by the blood. And so that increased oxygen leads to arterial dilation and you get increased perfusion. Or if that can't happen, you also get decreased CO2 leading to bronchial constriction. And decreased ventilation to match the poor perfusion. So you can either correct the perfusion, or if you can't correct the perfusion, you decrease the ventilation. You basically close off that alveolus and say it's not worth it. I'm going to send that air to a better area, to a better perfused area. Okay, so external respiration we've talked about so far depends on the structure of the respiratory membrane, the fact that it's thin, also that there's a huge surface area for gas exchange. It depends on matching ventilation and perfusion so that oxygen can be carried away by the blood, and blood is only going where there's oxygen to be found. The last thing that external respiration depends on is the partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So a way of thinking of the partial pressure is just almost like the concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide in air or in blood. So those are the three things that external respiration depends on. Internal respiration depends on tissue perfusion. So how much blood is getting to a tissue. But remember that blood flow to tissues is metabolically regulated so that blood goes to the tissues that need it most. Remember, we're talking about the internal tissues, so you actually have increased arterial diameter, arterial dilation, when you have a low oxygen supply, so that blood gets sent to the tissues that need the oxygen. The other thing that internal respiration depends on is the partial pressure gradients. So I held off on talking about that when we introduced it for external respiration, so that we can get a bit more into it now. So when you're talking about a mixture of gases like air is a combination of nitrogen and oxygen and carbon dioxide and water vapor, water. So since this is a mixture of gases, you can talk about the pressure exerted by a single gas. So rather than talking about air pressure, talk about the partial pressure of nitrogen in air, or the partial pressure of oxygen or carbon dioxide or water vapor in air. So it's directly proportional to the percentage of gas within the mixture. So like I said, as a kind of quick and dirty shorthand, you can think of it as the concentration of that particular gas within the mixture of gases. And the reason why I think it's useful to think of it as a concentration of the gas is because then you can take what you know about concentration gradients to think about partial pressure gradients. Now, in the partial pressures, in inhaled air, nitrogen, it's mostly nitrogen. You have a little less than 80% nitrogen, about 21% oxygen, small amounts of carbon dioxide, and water vapor. If you look at the alveolar air, you have a little bit less nitrogen, a little bit less oxygen, more carbon dioxide, and more water vapor. The alveolar air differs from the atmospheric air because of gas exchange. So you have oxygen diffusing into the blood and being carried away. You have carbon dioxide diffusing out of the blood into the alveolar air. You also have humidification of the air. Some of the water from that watery fluid in the lungs dissipates into the air in the alveoli. You actually lose a significant amount of water every day just by breathing. So that inhaled air mixes with the alveolar air, and you get, in exhaled air, you get mostly kind of somewhere in between. Now, thinking of a partial pressure as a concentration of gas is not quite technically correct, but it is directly related. And that direct relationship is known as Henry's law. It basically states that the amount of gas you have dissolved in a solution is proportional to the partial pressure of that gas. So the greater the partial pressure, the more of a gas will be in solution. Lower partial pressure, less will be in solution. The actual amount, the actual concentration in solution depends on its solubility. Carbon dioxide is more soluble than oxygen. Oxygen is more soluble than nitrogen. Clinically, this difference in solubility is something that divers have to contend with. So if you're diving deep under the ocean, you are increasing the pressures. So you're forcing more gas into the blood. And if you come up too fast, nitrogen, since nitrogen is the least soluble, nitrogen comes out and forms bubbles in your blood, which can be very, very painful and very dangerous. So it's not, a partial pressure isn't exactly the same as the concentration in a solution, but it is directly related. So understanding that a partial pressure gradient can somewhat be treated like a concentration gradient, you know that molecules move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So we can extend this to imply that gases move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So the last thing we need to understand in order to get what's happening during internal and external respiration is the differences in partial pressure gradients at the lungs and at the tissues. For external respiration, we're interested in the partial pressures in the lungs, in the alveolar air in the lungs, and we're interested in the partial pressures in the blood that's going into the lungs, the blood in those capillary beds. So if you want to, let's draw in our respiratory membrane. Remember, alveolar wall in black, capillary wall in red, basement membrane in blue. We have two partial pressures that we're primarily concerned with, oxygen and carbon dioxide. And for oxygen, the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli is 104 millimeters mercury, and it's only 40 in the blood. So there is a concentration gradient of oxygen, or excuse me, a partial pressure gradient of oxygen that looks like that. Greater pressure of oxygen in the alveolus, lower pressure of oxygen in the blood. For carbon dioxide, the partial pressure is 40 millimeters mercury in the alveoli and 45 millimeters mercury in the blood on average. So there's a slight, it's not as steep a concentration gradient, but there's a slight concentration gradient for carbon dioxide. And now remember that molecules will diffuse from an area of high partial pressure to an area of low partial pressure. So in the lungs, oxygen tends to move out of the alveolus into the blood, and carbon dioxide tends to move out of the blood into the alveolar air, where it can be exhaled. Now let's look at the same thing for internal respiration in the tissues. So in internal respiration, you are interested in the partial pressures of the blood in the tissue capillaries and the partial pressures in the tissues themselves. So you've got the capillary wall. I'm talking about diffusion into the extracellular fluid. So we're just going to leave the capillary wall there with blood and interstitial fluid. So, looking at oxygen, you have a partial pressure of oxygen in the blood of about 100 millimeters mercury. This is going to vary depending on how far you are from the lungs. And partial pressure of oxygen in the tissues is variable, but usually less than 40 millimeters mercury. So, the pressure gradient for oxygen looks like that. For carbon dioxide, pressure in the tissues is usually over about 45 millimeters mercury and about 40 millimeters mercury in the blood. So the pressure gradient for carbon dioxide looks like that. So oxygen will tend to move out of the blood into the interstitial fluid, and carbon dioxide will tend to move back into the blood. This is what the exchange looks like at the internal tissues. Now, these numbers are highly variable depending on the metabolic activity of the tissue. If you're talking about skeletal muscle during a marathon where you have highly metabolically active tissue, the oxygen concentration in the tissues is going to be much lower, and the carbon dioxide concentration in the tissues is going to be higher. So basically, these concentration gradients are going to get steeper if we're talking about highly metabolically active tissue. Okay, so after studying this video, you should be able to talk about partial pressure gradients, talk about how the partial pressure gradients change for oxygen and carbon dioxide depending on where in the body you're looking, and how these gradients relate to external and internal respiration. You should also be able to talk about ventilation perfusion matching in the lungs, the arterial response to oxygen and the bronchial response to carbon dioxide. And you should be able to talk about the respiratory membrane, remind yourself of what the structure of the respiratory membrane is, and why it makes for a barrier to gas exchange, but not too much of a barrier to gas exchange.